pretty much the same way in my first picture, in my second picture, and in my third picture outside. But let's now think about what's going to happen on the inside of your lung. So you already drawn some of these molecules inside your lungs, and now you're squishing them into much, much smaller volume. So all of those molecules are now really closely bunched together. You're not giving them much room at all. So the volume at this point decreased. So let me try to separate these three pictures so I'm not getting confused. Okay, so I'm going to ask Terry to help me out a little bit here. So where do I have high pressure on this diagram, and where do I have now low pressure on this diagram? First of all, let's start with high pressure. Where would I find that? Inside the lungs. So this is now high pressure. And then outside of my lungs, low pressure. And now, Laura, applying this general principle, right, that the air always moves from high pressure to low pressure, in what direction am I going to be moving that air? Up, right, from the lungs into the environment. So that's the grand total of the movement of that air. Okay.
Would your heart rate affect the rate of that movement? Your breathing, obviously. Say your heart rate goes up to exercise, then the rate of breathing will increase.
Absolutely.
And as your heart rate beats faster, it increases pressure within your
absolutely.
cardiovascular system.
But do you appreciate that this mechanism, it doesn't matter if your rate is low or rate is high, you're still going to be using exact same principles, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how fast you're breathing, how slow you're breathing, you're still going to go through the same sequence of events of increasing your volume of your cavity, increasing volume of your lungs. That then causes the pressure to drop, and therefore that's what's going to draw air in, and the opposite is going to be true for when you're breathing out, when you're suppressing the lungs and making them smaller. Okay? We're going to talk about rate of breathing and how that's controlled in the next bit. Okay, so this will come up. So it's a really relevant question, okay, which we will discuss soon. Okay, so here is where some students have real problem. Okay, maybe not you, but I'm sure there will be some people who, if they are following this lecture, is going to stop at this point and scratch their heads and tell me, Valeria, surely you've made a mistake, because look at this picture here. This is my outside environment, and I told you several times nothing changed in the outside environment, right? But then for some reason on this diagram I'm saying outside environment is high pressure, and on this next diagram I was telling you that nothing changed, but this time I'm telling it's low pressure. How does this work? How come this is labeled high pressure here and it's labeled low pressure here? Can anybody sort of try to explain why that is the case?
It's higher in the lung.
Exactly. So it's not really, it doesn't really matter what it is in itself, it's what you're comparing it to which matters. Okay? And I think some people have real difficulty grasping that concept. That even though it hasn't changed, but compared to the lungs, it's different. Can I tell you a little story, which I think sometimes helps some people to wrap their heads around this concept? So a few years ago now, there was a little documentary on, I think it was Channel 4. I think Channel 4 usually comes up with weird and wonderful documentaries. And this documentary, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody, that's not the purpose of that, right? But I'm just telling you the way I felt about this topic. And this documentary was about poverty in Britain, and so they, people who were making this documentary visited a number of families and kind of sat down to them and talked to them and kind of, you know, tried to understand how they feel about their situation. And so one of the families they visited, I believe it was a single mom, so she had 3 young kids, and they all go to school. And so she was saying that, you know, sometimes I wish I had more money, because sometimes I'm struggling to buy uniforms to these kids. Sometimes they, you know, school has got school trips and I can't afford to send them to these school trips, and etc., etc. Right? So she had, you know, reasons why she felt, you know, she wasn't as well off as she wished she was. And I think a lot of us can, you know, relate to that. But then at the same time, if you look around the room, these boys that came back from school and they were straight to playing PlayStation. There was this widescreen TV and level sofas, and they were sitting and playing this PlayStation. And what occurred to me at this point, right, if you take this setup, right, their whole life and lifestyle, and move it to somewhere in a, I don't know, refugee camp in Syria, where people are in toppling tents and they don't know when the next meal comes. They look at it and say, this person is rich, look at them. They have clothes to wear, they have somewhere to live, etc., etc. Right? At the same time, you move this setup in a different location, right, where people are driving nice cars and look, oh, see these guys, right? Live the, you know, see the house they live in, see the cars they drive. I feel poor. I haven't made it. Look at this person. Look how far they've got into life, and compared to me, right? And on the other end of the scale, there was this. I can't remember. It was, I think, a radio program or a TV program, but somebody discussing life in Monaco. So this guy, who's a millionaire, he feels he hasn't made it living in Monaco because it's only billionaires who feel they belong there. And if you're just a millionaire, then you don't feel like you've made it, because you can't afford to buy a yacht big enough, you can't afford to buy a number of cars to show off your wealth. Can you see what I'm trying to say, right? So it doesn't really matter what you have, I guess, right? It's what you're comparing yourself to, which matters, right? So you look at people who are much better off and you feel like, I haven't made it, I'm quite poor. And you may look at people who really have close to nothing, and you feel like, well, actually, this is not that bad. Can you see what I'm trying to say? Can you, some of you relate to that sentiment to a certain degree, okay? And so the bottom line of my story, why am I telling you this story? Well, because weirdly enough, the air pressure in your lungs work on a similar principle, right? Nothing changed outside, but what you're comparing it to changed. Right? So in this picture, I'm comparing it to low pressure, and therefore it became high pressure. And on this diagram, I was comparing it to high pressure. So compared to that, outside became low. Hope you can kind of relate to it a little bit more. Does that make sense? I don't know if it was worth my little story or not, but I think sometimes people just find it easier to relate to when we talk about those terms. Okay, so some of the common mistakes which people make, okay, so mistakes. So one of the common mistakes is, for example, saying that breathing in causes lungs to expand. Can you see a problem with that? Breathing in causes lungs to expand. And the problem is cause and effect, right? Because it's not breathing in which causes lungs to expand, it's lungs expanding, getting bigger volume, is what's going to draw the air in, causing you to breathe in. So the cause is exactly the opposite way around. So saying that would be something like putting a cart in front of a horse and saying the cart causes the horse to move, right, when it's the other way around. And you can do the same thing with breathing out, right? So breathing out causes lungs to contract or become smaller, right? So make sure you're not saying that, right? So these are mistakes. So that would be wrong way of putting those concepts. So the most important thing about the whole thing is doing it in a logical sequence and doing it with correct phrasing so that cause and effect are correct. I think that's the main pitfall which people kind of fall into, right? Because they're getting cause and effect exactly the other way around. They're putting cart in front of a horse. So one of the tips I would suggest is making sure you're mentioning events in the right sequence. So if you go back to what I was talking about, so events, the first thing you remember, we talked about the muscles. So it's the muscles which are causing a cause of these changes. So make sure you talk about muscles. So then make sure you talk about volumes. And then you talk about pressure of gases, of air. And then finally, you end up talking about the actual act of breathing in and out, because that's the last thing in the sequence that is actually happening. So then the last thing is the actual movement of air. So be careful with your cause and effect and phrasing of these concepts, okay? So cause and effect. So make sure you get that bit right. Okay? I appreciate a lot of people finding it quite difficult to start with, right? Because it's a lot of new information. Some of the stuff we're talking about pressures and volumes and stuff which comes from physics to a degree. So maybe you're finding it a little bit trickier. So what we'll do then in lessons, when I see people face to face, we'll do a number of revision exercises, and so we'll hopefully at some point it'll just click and we'll go, oh, okay, right, I think I get it now. So don't get too worried if you didn't quite get it first time round, right? So the people who are watching video, it might be the case of going back to beginning and rewatching it a couple of times and really try to understand it, or use some secondary resources also to help you to kind of wrap your head around this process of mechanics of breathing. Okay?